Thank you. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for chairing this panel. And yes, I have three of my Literary London students and my co-instructor here. For two of the students, this is their first ever academic conference, so very, very exciting. So the paper that I'm going to present today is entitled Merry Wives Out of Windsor, Geraldine Brophy's The Merry Wives of Windsor Avenue and Aotearoa New Zealand Identity. Some of Shakespeare's comedies explore overtly political themes like the nature of kingship and political authority in plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream and As You Like It, but few would accuse Merry Wives of Windsor of being a political play. Certainly, the play does not involve the foibles of kings, dukes, or other rulers, nor does it explore what it means to lead a polity wisely or well. Instead, Merry Wives is the closest Shakespeare comes to writing a city comedy, an early modern genre focused on the manners and stereotypes of urban, working, or middle-class characters. In this genre, everyday people, typically, though not always, Londoners, pursue love, money, social advantage, etc. in ways that satirize the emerging bourgeois class in England. Despite the popularity of the city comedy, Shakespeare never properly dipped his toes into the genre. Even Merry Wives, which comes closest, doesn't properly fit, being set in what was then a smallish town, Windsor, and not really satirizing bourgeois morality or ethics. Given how far removed Merry Wives is from conventional political discourse, it seems, at first glance, a strange choice for English-born Aotearoa New Zealand playwright Geraldine Brophy's 2008 adaptation, The Merry Wives of Windsor Avenue, which overtly explores the borderline political nature of Kiwi identity. In Brophy's play, political wrangling and interpersonal relationships drive the actions, while the characters' relative positions and concerns demonstrate an anxiety about New Zealand's place in international affairs. Shakespeare's play could be called political in a very broad conception of politics, one that sees issues once regarded as private as relevant to society at large. Polis, the Greek term from which politics comes. Shakespeare's Merry Wives addresses gender roles, gender sexual power, and the nature of marriage as a system of authority. In the early modern period, these would have been strictly domestic or private concerns, but today, following the feminist linkage of the personal and political, these issues are widely accepted as properly political issues. By contrast, I put Brody, but her name is Brophy, so I've got some typo that threw me off there. Brophy's play involves not just questions about gender roles and power, but direct political depictions. Broadly, Brophy triangulates the U.S. Ambassador George Page, British High Commissioner Frank Ford, and New Zealand officials Jack Falstaff and Sir Robert Shallow. Page is entirely self-confident, much like the Page of Shakespeare's play, never touched by any of the drama that flows around him, a reflection of the U.S.'s dominant global position and tendency toward unilateralism. Ford is ambivalent, alternating between critiquing the UK and a casually racist Anglo-supremacism. The Kiwi politicians, especially Falstaff, reveal telling concerns about New Zealand's place in the world. Their political concerns are small, petty, and provincial, and Falstaff tries to claim surreptitious power through affairs with Ford and Page's wives. These power dynamics suggest a concern about New Zealand's position as a small nation at the edge of a much more powerful global Anglophone order. Alongside the sexual politics of the Shakespeare, Brophy's adaptation explores internal New Zealand politics and New Zealand's international position within a broad Anglophone sphere. Central to this international politicization of Merry Wives is Jack Falstaff, the New Zealand Minister for Foreign Affairs. An ironically appropriate position considering how much of his focus is on conducting sexual affairs with Margaret and Anne Page, the wife and daughter of the U.S. Ambassador, and Alice Ford, the wife of the British High Commissioner. Unlike in Shakespeare, Brophy's Falstaff is sociopathic in his disregard for others and dedication to his own gratification, both sexual and political. There's nothing of the carnivalesque joie de vivre of Shakespeare's clown, though it's also true that the Falstaff of Merry Wives of Windsor is 100% not the Falstaff of the Henry IV plays. While the Falstaff in Shakespeare's Merry Wives is clearly a sexual predator, he retains at least remnants of the hail fellow, well-met good humor of his Henry IV incarnation. But Brophy's version is entirely callous, cruel, and self-serving, without any of the charisma or charm of his Shakespearean predecessor. In the adaptation, Falstaff delights in the suffering of others, in gaining power over them, and manipulating them. Also, unlike the Shakespeare, which centers its plot on Mistresses Ford and Page resisting Falstaff's unwelcome pursuit and shaming Ford for his unwarranted jealousy, in Brophy's play, it's clear from scene 3 that Falstaff and Elizabeth are having an affair which Ford doesn't know about. Now, this is actually a really, really interesting point. I'm going to diverge slightly because we only have 3 presenters rather than the 4 we were expecting. As part of our Literary London trip, we went and saw Merry Wives produced at the Globe. And in the Globe's performance, Mistress Ford probably makes out with Falstaff 8 times. So there is clearly much more going on there than you would inherently get from Shakespeare's text. But in Brophy's play, it's 100% clear that they are having a sexual affair. Back to the paper. Emblematic of Falstaff's sociopathy is his attempt to blackmail Alice. He conspires with Ham Slender, the nephew and advisor of Falstaff's political rival Robert Shallow, to stage incriminating, though fake, pictures of Elizabeth having an affair with a different man. Falstaff does this, as he explains, because I may need some insurance in case she gets hormonal, starts telling tales out of the bedroom. And in the final scene of Brophy's reworking, when it's revealed that Falstaff also had an affair with Margaret Page, he unsuccessfully attempts to blackmail her as well. He threatens, "I could tell George about us." And Margaret replies that her husband already knows and, "He's long since forgiven me. However, I'm not sure if he'll ever forgive you." Given that Alice and Margaret are both the wives of high-ranking foreign officials, Falstaff's liaisons with them and attempts to leverage those affairs against their husbands has an inherently political angle to it, beyond the sexual scumbaggery displayed. Scumbaggery is a technical term, by the way. Outside its indications of his personal immorality, Falstaff's attempts to leverage sexual affairs against both the US ambassador and the UK High Commissioner reflect the peripheral position of New Zealand within a broader Anglophone world. The Anglophone world, led by the US and UK, has historically been relatively unified since the late 19th century, and the bonds forged during the 2 world wars solidified those alliances, especially with the large-scale participation of Anzac troops from Australia and New Zealand. However, as the notion of a unified British world disintegrated in the post-World War II period, countries like New Zealand, Australia, and Canada had to reassess their relationships with the more economically, politically, and militarily powerful Anglophone nations. As historian Jatinder Mann argues, in the 1950s, Aotearoa New Zealand very much identified itself as a British country and an integral part of a wider British world which had the UK at its heart. However, by the 1970s, this British world had come to an end, as had Aotearoa New Zealand's self-identification as a British nation. Now, for a number of reasons, Britain's role at the center of a unified British Commonwealth became less central to United Kingdom politics in the 1950s and 60s, alienating largely Anglophone nations like New Zealand. For the purposes of my argument here, this means that Kiwis became less reliant on and less aligned with British politics and identity, developing a more independent politico-cultural identity around New Zealand nationality. Simultaneously, during the post-World War II period, U.S. hegemony became increasingly dominant throughout the so-called Free World, which included New Zealand and much of the global Anglophone sphere. New Zealand has been a major U.S. ally in the Pacific, with Kiwi troops serving alongside Americans in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. However, New Zealand has clearly and consistently been a junior partner to U.S. global operations, peripheral to larger and more militarily and economically powerful partners like Canada and Australia, to say nothing of the United Kingdom. In this context, Falstaff's approach to international affairs seems like an attempt to circumvent the norms of international power relations by establishing surreptitious dominance over the British and American politicians. He uses sexual politics to try and gain both a romantic edge and blackmail material over his counterparts, perhaps out of an unconscious concern about New Zealand's subordinate position within the global Anglophone sphere. In this sense, Falstaff's sexual escapades can be read as a form of resistance to a global power structure in which New Zealand is politically subordinated. The other aspect of Falstaff's politicking is his seemingly unmotivated attempts to destroy Robert Shallow over what appears a relatively minor scandal. In Scene 2, we learn that Shallow has unintentionally eaten a protected species of native pigeon, which he was offered by a kuia, or female elder, while visiting a group of Maori. While this would be a faux pas for any elected official, for the Minister of Conservation, eating a protected species of wildlife is a direct violation of his public responsibilities. The scene actually begins with Shallow and his advisor, Ham Slender, discussing whether Falstaff can use this event to hurt Sir Robert's political career, and Falstaff himself refers to using the incident to destroy his rival, though no reason is ever given for his hatred of Shallow. This reflects the other aspect of New Zealand politics I argue that Brophy's play illustrates, which is its provincial nature. Falstaff decides to destroy another man's career without any apparent objective correlative, to borrow T.S. Eliot's term. There's no compelling reason why Falstaff should target Sir Robert Shallow. Nothing in the plot or in their relationship particularly justifies this course of action or explains the motivations, which of course is what Eliot means by an objective correlative. But beyond this, the relatively small, almost absurd basis for Falstaff's campaign, that Swallow unknowingly ate a protected bird, highlights the parochial concerns at the forefront of internal New Zealand politics. Although Shallow's mistake suggests a personal lack of knowledge about the animals he's charged with conserving, the eating of a single protected bird, which had already been killed and prepared by the Maori in observance of a traditional ritual, likely matters very little to the overall political or ecological situation in New Zealand. And while Brophy suggests that Sir Robert is not especially knowledgeable, Falstaff is not motivated by any desire to preserve protected avians, despite stirring up a scandal over the incident. In this critique of internal Kiwi politics, Brophy's satire aligns with a trend of sardonic and self-deprecating humor common in New Zealand culture, ironically an inheritance of British culture. And it's fitting that Brophy deploys this mode of traditionally British humor in adapting a comedy by England's most famous playwright, because this adaptation aligns the craft of her play with the content of challenging New Zealand's subordinate position within a larger Anglophone cultural sphere. Brophy uses the bard, arguably the symbol of British literature, to write back to the Anglophone metropole, staking a New Zealand claim to and legitimizing her political project by association with Shakespeare. The concept of writing back is important in post-colonial theory, referring to works by post-colonial authors that challenge imperialist assumptions of the colonizing nation's superiority over those colonized. I had a bit in here about how strikingly absent the Maori actually are from this play. I cut that in the interest of time, but we can talk about that during questions if you want. So the act of writing back to the imperial center is born out of resistance to such cultural hegemony. Brophy is partially writing back to the British and American power centers, though her audience is a Kiwi one, not a British or an American one. The play was commissioned by Centrepoint Theatre in Palmerston North and the now defunct Downstage Theatre in Wellington. The show received a public reading at Downstage in 2008, though I haven't found a record of a full production or any subsequent performances. In this context, in this sort of context of writing back and claiming Shakespeare for a New Zealand audience, it is striking how unlikable the figures representing New Zealand are. Mm-hmm. Falstaff is, as I said, sociopathic, cruel, and lacking Shakespeare's boisterous good humor, Both Sir Robert Shallow and Ham Slender are largely incompetent and self-absorbed, figures to be laughed at more than laughed with. And given the unlikability of the Kiwi characters, Brophy's reclaiming of Merry Wives of Windsor as a New Zealand cultural text offers only a compromised response to Anglophone imperial powers. Falstaff attempts to strike a blow against British and American hegemony, but he does so in such a repugnant and unsympathetic way that it's difficult to support him or the spirit of Kiwi individuality and independence that his anti-British and anti-American ethos represents. Thank you.